Shall we get started?
Mm-hmm.
All right, welcome to week 8 of our tour through the Hidden Words. As we've gone through the weeks, we've, I think, gradually started looking at groupings of hidden words, as, at least in the Arabic, it seems there are some thematic areas that arise connected to Baha'u'llah's claim at the beginning that this represents the inner essence of the religions of the past. So what are some of the aspects of the inner essence of religion? Something about what we are intrinsically as participating in the divine. There's something about how we have, as human beings, a choice whether to participate in that divinity which is us or whether we choose to remain remote from us. There is the theme of the consequent spiritual responsibility we have towards the poor and the downtrodden among us. There's the anticipated reunion that I'm going through these topics here. The anticipated reunion at the end as a consequence of this. And in this particular week, we're looking at another, in some ways, I think, very challenging topic in the spiritual life, which is, I think, again, a universal that we see across every great faith tradition, and that is that the spiritual path has something to do with our letting go of our ego and going with the flow of the divine, being submissive and obedient to that thing which is greater than us. Particular, I think, challenge in light of the culture that we're immersed in, the culture of individualism, a culture that says I as an individual have the right to be my own entity, to express myself any way I like, that I have the right to disagree with everyone and everything. I have the right to be disobedient. Civil disobedience is kind of almost sacredly enshrined in our culture from a very early time, and so that's why to me there's a challenge here, and I hope that we can have a really great conversation about it, because there's something I think very attractive about the idea that disobedience can be a great thing, especially if you're facing injustice. In a way, the Baha'i faith starts from a position of disobedience. It starts from a position of Baha'u'llah saying, don't listen to the clergy, listen to your own heart. Follow your own, wherever your own independent investigation of reality leads, which implicitly means you're going to be disobedient to the power structures that surround you. So some form of disobedience is intrinsic, but in just these few hidden words, and we'll read these 4 and then a selection of quotations that further deepen this topic. The other side of that same coin is that somewhere along the spiritual path lies a kind of a surrender, and a surrender of one's own will, and a being obedient to something greater. So how do these two relate to each other is the question in my mind as I read these. So maybe we could start by just going around. There's only 4 hidden words in this section, and but we can continue after those 4, and we could just read our way through this and then have a conversation about it.
What numbers again?
Unless these are numbers 37 through 40, but they're actually also in the handout this time. So this time I put those 4 in the handout, so you don't actually need a separate hidden words book for this evening. So we could just go around, read them all, unless you have something like really urgently you want to say about one at the in between, in which case feel free to start off at any point.
Just
Otherwise,
a quick question.
yeah.
Hidden Words was revealed before, during the first few years in Baghdad, right?
Yes.
This is before Kitab Abbas.
Way before.
So obedience to what?
Great question. Great question. What is it? What does obedience to God mean? That's the question. So after we read these, hopefully we'll have some ammunition to talk about it in relation to these passages. Okay. I'll start. O Son of Man, divest not thyself of my beauteous robe, and forfeit not thy portion from my wondrous fountain, lest thou shouldst thirst for evermore.
O Son of Being, walk in my statutes for love of me, and deny thyself that which thou desirest, if thou seekest my pleasure.
O Son of Man, neglect not my commandments if thou lovest my beauty, and forget not my counsels if thou wouldest attain my good pleasure.
O Son of Man, wert thou to speed through the immensity of space and traverse the expanse of heaven, yet thou wouldst find no rest save in submission to our command and humbleness before our face.
What's your prescription? 95?
No glasses, can't read.
None can escape the snares he setteth, and no soul can find release except through submission to his will. Baha'u'llah.
God hath ordained that all the good things which lie in the treasury of his knowledge shall be attained through obedience unto me, and every fire recorded in his book through disobedience unto me.
Do that which hath been hidden you by him who is compassionate and merciful. We school you with the rod of wisdom and laws, like unto the father who educateth his son, and this for naught but the protection of your own selves and the elevation of your stations.
Say from my laws, the sweet-smelling savor of my garment can be smelled, and by their aid the standards of victory will be planted upon the highest peaks. The tongue of my power hath from the heaven of my omnipotent glory addressed to my creation these words: observe my commandments for the love of my beauty. Happy is the lover that hath inhaled the divine fragrance of his best beloved from these words, laden with the perfume of a grace which no tongue can describe. Think not that we have revealed unto you a mere code of laws. Nay, rather have we unsealed the choice wine with the fingers of might and power. Whenever my laws appear like the sun in the heaven of mine utterance, they must be faithfully obeyed by all, though my decree be such as to cause the heaven of every religion to be cleft asunder.
Regard men as a flock of sheep that need a shepherd for their protection. This verily is the truth, the certain truth. We approve of liberty in certain circumstances and refuse to sanction it in others. We verily are the all-knowing. Say, true liberty consisteth in man's submission unto my commandments, little as you know it. Were men to observe that which we have sent down unto them from the heaven of revelation, they would of a certainty attain unto perfect liberty. Happy is the man that hath apprehended the purpose of God in whatever he hath revealed from the heaven of his will, that pervadeth all created things. Say, the liberty that profiteth you is to be found nowhere except in complete servitude unto God, the eternal truth. Whoso hath tasted of its sweetness will refuse to barter it for all the dominion of earth and heaven.
The source of the source of all good is trust in God, submission unto his command, and contentment with his holy will and pleasure. The source of all glory is acceptance of whatsoever the Lord hath bestowed, and contentment with that which God hath ordained. The essence of understanding is to testify to one's poverty and submit to the will of the Lord, the sovereign, the gracious, the all-powerful.
Prefer not your will to mine, never desire that which I have not desired for you, and approach me not with lifeless hearts, defiled with worldly desires and cravings.
True belief in God and recognition of him cannot be complete save by acceptance of that which he hath revealed, and by observance of whatsoever hath been decreed by him and set down in the book by the pen of glory.
The ordinances of God have been sent down from the heaven of his most august revelation. All must diligently observe them. Man's supreme distinction, his real advancement, his final victory have always depended and will continue to depend upon them. Whoso keepeth the commandments of God shall attain everlasting felicity.
By self-surrender, Hana, and perpetual union with God is meant that man should merge their will wholly with the will of God, and regard their desires as utter nothingness besides his purpose. Whatsoever the Creator commandeth, his creatures observe. The same must they diligently and with utmost joy and eagerness arise and fulfill the station of absolute self-surrender transcendent, and will ever remain exalted above every other station.
In all these journeys, the wayfarer must stray not a hair's breadth from the law, for this is indeed the secret of the path and the fruit of the tree of truth. And in all these stages, he must cling to the robe of obedience and to all that hath been enjoined, and hold fast to the cord of shunning all that is forbidden, that he may partake of the cup of the law and be informed of the mysteries of truth.
Affliction and troubles are due to the state of not being content with what God hath ordained for one. If one submits himself to God, he is always happy. A man asks another, in what station are you? The other answered, in the utmost happiness. Where does this happiness come from? Because all existing things move according to my wish, I do not find anything contrary to my desire. Therefore I have no sorrow. There is no doubt that all the beings move by the will of God, and I have given up my own will, desiring the will of God. When man surrenders himself, everything will move according to his will, to his wish.
Depend thou upon God. Forsake thine own will and cling to his. Set aside thine own desires and lay hold of his.
The fourth phrase of the aforementioned utterance, which points out the way of salvation, is obedient to the commandments of his Lord. It is certain that man's highest distinction is to be lowly before and obedient to his God, that his greatest glory, his most exalted rank and honor, depend on his close observance of the divine commandments and prohibitions.
He doeth as he doeth, and what recourse have we? He carrieth out his will, he ordaineth what he pleaseth. Then better for thee to bow down thy head in submission, and put thy trust in the all-merciful Lord.
So, what does this mean?
it's very simple, isn't it?
Sounds
It's
very
not
simple.
complicated, and it's at the highest station you can attain, and
Yeah.
all you have to do is just give up your will to God, and you're done.
But you really don't want to.
Exactly. Yeah.
You really don't want to.
Well, maybe
easy.
you don't want to.
It's not complicated. It's just difficult.
I mean, we're raised to believe I'm my own person. Surrendering that's giving up, right? Surrendering is an admission of defeat. The real person is the real self-fulfilled individual, is the one that breaks the rules, the one that doesn't respect all of these artificial boundaries and all of these useless. I'm trying to steel man the other side so that we have
Some debate.
some debate here.
It seems weak.
And aren't there many places in Baha'u'llah's own writings where he says, each of you is my unique gem. It sounds a lot like that's what you ought to be, is you, as a unique one.
It's interesting because it's also contradictory to what we've been reading, which is we are all one. We're also individuals. We're all one and the same, come from the same dust, come from the same tree, and yet we are individual and asked to be individuals. I think it's very contradictory in the mind. It's like I am to regard you as a part of me, and me a part of you, and yet I am unique and different.
And that's to be celebrated.
Whenever I hear contradictory in my mind, I try to think multifaceted rather than, because contradictory means binary. It's either or,
Sure.
right or wrong.
Yeah.
And multifaceted is that
Thank you.
idea of looking at things from so many different angles, that there are so many possibilities that can happen all at once.
Right.
But you still want to make sense of it. You want to connect the dots, right?
Yeah.
And the independent search for truth, when compared to not deviating hair's breadth from the law, I mean, that raises all sorts of questions in me. Where do you find the confidence in the authority behind the law?
And which law?
Yeah.
And if as Baha'u'llah says, laws come and go, they're abrogated, new laws take their place. If that's the case, how does one know, which law is the right law at any given time?
That reminds me of when Jesus was talking to the pharaohs. I forget what they were called. I'm sorry. Pharisees. And they were saying they were trying to trick him into saying that he wouldn't give money towards Caesar. And his comment was that it has to do with being obedient to the world in which we live in, but also obedient to God, which was give unto God what is God and give unto Caesar what is Caesar's. And so when you were talking, that was reminding me of that concept, which is most of all manifestations say the same thing, which is we are to be respectful of the world that we live in and the society with which we live in, and yet we were asked to be different and not to be submissive to the society in which we live in, like to think differently, and yet but also have the understanding that we are to be obedient to the world we live. Like I cannot not pay my taxes just because I don't believe it. This is the future or whatever it is that I believe in. I can't just do anarchy, but I have to also respect the world in which I live in.
So acting within certain constraints is a feature of this world. We could probably all agree to that children, as they're being raised, need to listen to their parents, because we're not born knowing everything we need to know to survive in this world. So there's some basis, at least in nature, for obedience and submission to a higher power being something we need to do. That's true as individuals. It's also true once we get together as in a society. Then there also have to be guardrails and limitations on freedom that counterbalances the freedoms that are our inalienable rights. I guess maybe with everything, there's always a balance to be struck. It's not, on the one hand, one should take pride in obeying no law and respecting no constraint, and on the opposite extreme, one doesn't want to be among the acquiescent masses that never undertake their own investigation of reality, which has to be transgressive in some way. The investigation of spirituality, if accepting one spirituality means rejecting someone else's spiritual reality, accepting one law and following that one law to the letter means not following another law. And so one has to undertake a process of deciding which one.
And with Jesus, all the law of the prophets came down in his teaching to the love of God with all your heart and the love of neighbor. I mean, that contained all the law. So that's kind of a different sense of what the law is. I think so much of it has to do with trustworthiness. Do you trust the authority?
Yes.
From parenthood to spirituality, you look for what's trustworthy, and that's where the search is. That's almost where
That's where the authority is.
yeah.
One aspect of this that I find interesting is that the obedience that these passages are talking about are in a way abstracted from authority. They're abstracted from compelling authority, from coercive authority, because one has the choice to follow any of this or not. None of this is a matter of compulsion. And as Baha'u'llah says, and this is from the opening paragraphs of his Book of Laws, so it's a very central statement in the 4th quotation: observe my commandments for the love of my beauty. So the observation of this, the submission, is not the submission of one cowering under the threat of the sword. It's the submission of a lover enthralled by the beloved, who throws their head at the feet of the beloved, and it's entirely a self-willed act that
Obedience.
yes.
And who's behind the law but the all-merciful? It's not the punitive or the judge or the judger, it's the all-merciful.
Well, there's also this aspect of, when we think of having to submit and be obedient outside of this context, it's like a punishment or but here it's whoso hath tasted of its sweetness will refuse to barter it for all the dominion of earth and heaven. So this kind of obedience is the bringer of great joy and happiness. It's a completely different thing from what we think of outside of this, I think.
Also, like in the world where we live, when we think of law, we think of sort of a behavioral command. And I'm getting from this that it will eventuate a behavior, but where the deepest piece of obedience is the honoring that God in beauty and mercy and tender regard for every one of his created children wants what's best for them. And it's a journey toward what's the behavioral outcome of living in that kind of relationship with God. It's almost mystical, which sort of dissolves the whole idea of, a behavioral formula for obedience. And yet, there's a lot of behavioral, just vary one,
Well, and don't backbite, and there's lots of things like that.
very specific behaviors.
When I look in nature for other analogies that might help illuminate, I also think of the chrysalis and the butterfly, where at a certain stage of its existence, the caterpillar forms this hard shell around it, which is highly confining, doesn't allow it to move at all. It's basically frozen in that way for quite a long period of time. But there's a wisdom behind that, and that's allowing it to rearrange all its internal components so it can progress to that next stage of its existence. Maybe there's something to that as well. And I think of that particularly when I read this quotation at the bottom of page 1, which, if I have my cynical hat on, I read that and I go, this is a kind of Orwellian doublespeak, right? You read 1984 and like freedom is slavery and truth is falsehood and all of that. Baha'u'llah says true liberty consists in man's submission to my commandments. So how is it that true liberty consists in submitting to commandments? But in sort of in light of this, of the analogy of the chrysalis, the commandments are like the chrysalis, and that's the path to true liberty for the caterpillar. It has to go through that stage so that it can then become the butterfly and then have true freedom.
So is the caterpillar inside the shell engaging in an independent search for truth?
I don't know where to go with it.
Analogies are what they are. They have their limits. They have their limits. If they go too far, they fall apart.
That's right. Yeah, it's not a fair
I think
question.
Gary's got something here. I really do. The Baha'i faith is a faith without clergy. Now, with that in mind, and you hear when Baha'u'llah talks about following the law, who's to say what the law is? We don't have a clergy to tell us. It's up to us. It's independent investigation of truth. And we decide what the law is. Obviously, each one of us is going to decide technically what the law is based on our understanding of reading what the law is and the social norms that we're part of. But then you read my favorite thing about where Baha'u'llah wrote in that letter from B to A. And he says very clearly when asked about what is the truth of things, and Baha'u'llah says, well, look, every single human heart has their own unique idea about what is the truth. He says, so that's the way it's always been. Baha'u'llah says, that's the way it will always be. And so for everybody in this room and everybody in all of society, we all have a little different idea about what it is the truth. What is the right? What is the law? Right? We all have that. So now, how do we put that all together? And it's that search for truth. That is really what it's all about. Because when you think that you found the truth, you probably haven't. But when you think you found the truth, you feel really good about it. And then if you can figure out how to live by what you believe to be the truth, you feel really good about that. And then later on, you discover, well, I kind of sort of had it right, but it wasn't really quite all the way there. And you change. You get better. And you do a lifetime of this changing all the time. Society is changing around you at the same time. And so you have to get it all to fit all the time. And you're constantly changing your understanding of what is the truth. What is the right way? How should I be living right now? It's a struggle. It's work. But you feel good when you succeed. For a while.
That's right.
It's also just the exercise. It's part of what the whole purpose of growth. You have to come at it with a lack of knowledge and you learn from others and you learn from your mistakes, and it's the way things are set up. And so these things are all kind of the way it is, the way it should be, you know. And so, yeah, that education is a very valuable thing. And that process of making mistakes is a valuable thing, worthwhile.
It is a valuable thing. In fact, we know that with our children, isn't it? We know that a child doesn't go straight from being a child to an adult. There's a long process there where they do the right thing and they do the wrong thing, and they learn from those experiences, right? And there's that long process of learning to get to where you hope to eventually go. I assume we're doing the same thing spiritually. We're trying to get to adult spiritual, and it's a struggle.
And one necessary component about the search for truth is looking at yourself, looking at the world, and saying something's missing. You're noticing an absence that draws you into something more, so that the absence is no longer, diminishing you. So the independent search for truth, it seems to me, is both a positive and negative engagement, where you're seeing what you don't have, and I need to fill that emptiness. And if God is the one who's inviting into that, Mommy, then we see sort of moral steps, we see informational steps, we see the emotions of feeling good when this aha moment happens, where what we didn't have is suddenly fulfilled. All of that is happening, and that's kind of the journey to God, isn't it? So,
I think so.
yeah.
You know, my impression of these four hidden words, I don't think we're talking about laws here. I think we're talking about submission to the will of, submission to what is. I mean, that's in Buddhism, right? It gives us a comfort in life, because many things happens to us. You saw past week what happened to all of us, right? Suddenly, if we are submissive to that gives us comfort. I think that's my opinion. These four are referring to that, not to the laws, not to the actually think of either civil laws or religious laws, because there are so many of them. Which one should we go with? And even this was before the laws of Baha'u'llah. And this cannot be applicable to that, right? Just
Well, so should we? What does it mean to do that? So if this isn't about following certain laws that are written down in a book, if it's more submitting to fate, submitting to the things over which we have no control, then is that just the same as, say, Stoic philosophy? Is it basically saying, and does it take away from like our agency to make the world better? Like, is there a tension there between, on the one hand, well, that's just the way things are, and I just need to submit to that, and on the other hand, hold on, things are this way, and I don't like that, and it's not in accord with my view of how things should be, so I'm going to go and try to change things. So
it's not passive necessarily. Submission doesn't necessarily mean
passivity. Okay, so how then are you fully submissive to the will of God in the sense that these passages are saying, and at the same time being like an active agent of change in one's society, in one's personal relationships and so forth? How do you square that circle?
Well, then the will of God, and many we have writings that tell us what the will of God is for us to act, to do things for the betterment of humanity, not just to sit around and go, oh well, that's the way it is. What can I do? So that submission can't just be passive, I think. But it takes effort to find out what the will of God is, and I think the thing that we haven't touched on, I think I'd have to read more of these to see where we understand that we find what God wants within ourselves. We look inside ourselves, and that's where we can find the will of God. But obviously we have writings as well. We have the laws of today, that we can refer to. But yeah, to me, submission to the will of God is acting on injustice, seeing injustice and trying to do something about it. The way in which we do that is probably also, we have to understand what God's will would be and the way that we might go about that.
I think just doing the best we can do, to do the best responses to all these things that are happening in the world, do our best. But it's very likely we are not going to get the result we want. But that should not create any anxiety and stress and things like this.
Another analogy I've seen in the Baha'i writings, and I don't think it's unique to the Baha'i writings, is thinking about our free will like a sailboat, on the ocean, and you're trying to get across the ocean, and your free will is like, well, if you take the rudder and like try to steer the ship, against the wind, you're not going to make any progress. But submitting to the will of God then becomes knowing which way the wind is blowing, and I'm not talking about the cultural winds of the moment, but like that breeze of God that's flowing through all things, drawing everything back to the source. It's like identifying where that wind is, and then adjusting one's sails to go downstream with that wind. That's a kind of self-surrender, because you're not trying to move across the current. You're trying to find where is the path back to the one, realizing that when you align your consciousness and your actions with whatever that path is, then you make the most progress. And Barbara said earlier that, quoting from the Bible, about the really is just the one law, and that's love. Baha'u'llah said exactly the same thing. He said all the laws and ordinances of all religions change with the times, except for, he says, the law of love, which he says, like a fountain, is ever flowing and renewed and ever in motion. And so it's a beautiful metaphor of a fountain, because it's something it's a fixed thing. That's the one thing that's constant. But that one thing that's constant is also very dynamic and itself always in motion.
Emptying.
Self-emptying and self-renewing.
And that's the kind of place of submission, obedience to that pattern of love, which is self-emptying. And I was just, I was thinking, in our society, we always ask the question, who am I? But I think it's more like, whose am I? And if we're created in the image and likeness of God, God already has a claim on us. And so, we're individuals in the sense that we have that beautiful opportunity to discover just how God has a claim on us. We're not automatons. We don't do it all in the exact same way. But the law is what's embedded in us. That's the reality, like you were saying, sort of what's real. God is within what's real. That's kind of the law. I don't know if that makes sense.
I have a question. I want to hear what people make of this next quote under the hidden words. None can escape the snares he setteth.
Snares of what?
None can escape the snares he setteth. And then the next half of the sentence, no soul can find release except through submission to his will. But I'm really like, what the heck does that mean? So I'm curious to hear people's thoughts about that. The snares.
The snare is like God is trying to entrap us in something, or is plotting behind the scenes. There's a famous hadith that says, "They plotted and God plotted, and verily God is the best of plotters."
Is that
right? and the hounds of heaven, are incessantly after us.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of, there may be snares along the way that it us.
Well, and one response to what you're saying that just came to me is that, yeah, your initial thought when you think of snare, it's like, here is something from some external power that's going to clamp you into something that you don't want to be. You want to tear away from the snare. You want to keep running in the forest if you're a deer or whatever it may be. But the other way to look at it maybe is, what we're being reminded is that there is this part of us that keeps choosing to be human rather than spirit. And that's the part that needs to get ensnared so that we can become spirit. You know, if we're not just always running like an animal in the forest, and some snare mercifully contains us so that we can then be still and present for the purpose of the person who set the snare, who may not be a bad guy after all. Maybe God.
I think of those Chinese finger traps. Did you
Oh, yeah.
You put your fingers in, and it's a woven thing, and then you try and pull it out, it grabs. The more you try, or the monkey on the other side of the cage with an apple or a banana, and you can't get it through unless he lets go. And then,
Right.
But yeah, that resistance. Yeah, when you let go, when the only way to get it off is to relax, and then you can.
It seems to me that when I think of the snare, the snare stops you and catches you, holds you tight. You're trapped. You've got to think about what's going to happen now. And people don't change whatever they're doing until they become uncomfortable.
Absolutely.
You have to be uncomfortable to change. If you're not uncomfortable, you're not going to change your behavior, your thinking, or anything. How about just stay. Snare traps you and makes you hold on. Think about what's going on right now. And then you have a chance to think. If you use the snare, you have the opportunity to think. Opportunity doesn't mean you will. You have an opportunity.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
I also think that the second part of that sentence is actually important because it seems to say that you get caught in a trap and the only way you can get out of it is through submission to God's will. And so that seems to suggest what kind of snare it might be. You might be saying that the snares are whatever it is that we want for ourselves. Those are the traps, and that's what I think too about this. The only true liberty is submission, because when we're all like wrapped up in what we want and what we're trying to get, then we're not free at all. We're completely imprisoned by those selfish desires. And so letting it go and submitting to the will of God instead of clinging to what we want is completely freeing.
Unless, as this quote on the back sheet says, unless we've aligned our will with the will of God, then what we desperately want is perfect, because that's the will of God, and we always get what we want because we've achieved alignment.
I'm curious what people's thoughts are on what things keep us from doing that. What kinds of things cause us to not, especially when we know what God's will is and we decide not to do it. I suppose ignorance could be one of those things if we don't know what God's will is and we keep bumping into things and, we're told that the same tests keep happening until we figure out what we're doing wrong, and then we grow from that. But some of them, I suppose, fear is probably one of the biggest ones. We're afraid, but what is it we're afraid of, and why won't we let go? Because I think about the things that I find that are really hard to be obedient or to let go, because I'm afraid that if I let go, I'm going to lose something. So that's the trust that you were mentioning. It's like I'm not going to get what I really think I need, and yet I know I'm being ignorant, because I know that Well, I believe in God. I believe God is completely omnipotent and infallible, and yet I'm choosing over God.
Yeah.
I'm deciding, no, I know better.
Mm-hmm.
But so yeah, I'm just curious if people have any thoughts about that.
No, I think it's all about contentment. And here's the way it goes. I think there is, we can call it God, but at the same time, I call it this whole nature. We are in a pool of things that are happening right and left. Technology growing so fast, science going the other way, religions are fighting and all this stuff, and we individually are willing to do this. I want to go approach that thing, and that thing doesn't happen, and I get upset, and depression, anxiety, and stress, and all this stuff comes to me. But this is referring to contentment. It says, will of God is will of nature. What we are in the swimming pool that we are moving, if we really submit and be content to what is, then there's no anxiety, there's no stress. And as a matter of fact, things will come to you. You become a magnet to things that you couldn't even imagine. You don't, just like that ring in the 7 valleys. You just find the lover instead of that ring. You find the whole thing. But you have to be content and submissive to what is. That doesn't mean that you don't do your work. You do your work in this pool of happenings, but you have contentment. And that contentment is actually something that helps us to not have the anxiety and stress.
Is that the purpose of Buddhist meditation?
Yeah, I think so. I have an interesting thing that happened to me was when I sit down to meditate, normally there is a muscle here underneath my foot that really cramps, and the hurt is unbelievable. It's like your leg is breaking in half. One time I said, you know what? I'm going to practice to this what is, see what happens. So I started observing that thing, and it's so difficult because you're observing this excruciating pain in your leg, but all it takes is between 10 to 20 seconds of observing this pain, and suddenly the muscle releases itself and the pain goes away. It's all, if you have that thing, try it. Because I tried it multiple times and it works. It's hard, but it works. It's very similar to this things that happens in life. Things hard, you wanted your daughter to be this, you wanted your car to be that. Never happens.
So you're saying just observe, just have an awareness of it? Like just observe it without any judgment or action?
Yeah, observe.
What is it? Yeah, I've done
Just
the
be
same
aware.
thing. It's a really interesting concept. And there's a mindfulness teaches that.
Yeah.
I did it with emotions and anxiety. I had a therapist that taught me how to do that, which was being aware of the emotion, but not letting myself see the emotion as anything more than just the emotion. Like separating myself from it. So it's not, meditation isn't forgetting, it's observing what is and what's coming into your mind, all of the intrusive thoughts, and acknowledging that they exist, but they don't consume you. And so the same thing, the concept of the pain, where the pain exists, you feel it, but it doesn't consume you. And then it just kind of the same thing would happen with me with my emotions and my anxieties, which is I would see them and then I keep going further and further away to the point where they just don't bother me the way they did, or I see them differently than I did before. Meditation can be very therapeutic in that way.
The difference is I'm in pain versus my foot is in pain.
Right.
Because then there's separation between what you are and what your leg is.
Yeah.
So you don't identify yourself with it. You see it as sort of a wave passing through.
Because I think as human beings, we take things personally. We take every aspect of life very personally, and to the point where we think that this is happening to me. Why is this happening to me? Why,
Must be a reason.
And it's this constant theme that we are in the society that we live in, that we think this is me, and many times in the reality that we live in, it's not about you, the person. It's your reaction to what's going on, or your past experiences that are shaping your current experience today. Like, why are you triggered by this? Or even the person's responses, what they're saying or what they're doing has nothing to do with you. It's their responses to the situation in which they're in. And so, like, therapy has really, like, forced me to personally start to think about these things. And I was observing myself when I was reading these things and thinking, like, my immediate gut reaction is to go back to my childhood, where, like, the priests and the nuns would make me feel that, like, God is the Almighty and He's the most powerful and He's on this throne and He's judging, right? And I think I grew up with this whole concept of God judges me, and therefore I must always constantly be my best self, not to be my best self for myself, but because He's judging me and everything. And just that, I think it was just that generation too. Like, my grandparents, that generation was to, like, scare kids into doing things based on this concept of judgment. And when I became a Baha'i, I had to really learn how to lose that concept of God, the way I grew up with God. And I feel like with the writings of Baha'u'llah, there's this constant love. There is absolute authority that we must conform to. But at the same time, there's this love and this understanding. An example for that for me would be drinking alcohol. I grew up drinking alcohol and I never really thought much of it. And then when I became a born-again Christian, the whole concept was you're not supposed to drink alcohol to get drunk. And then, but where's that fine line of getting drunk, right? So, like, we would always drink, but then, like, skipping, we're like grazing that drunk stage because it's really hard not to. And so I just remember always thinking that concept, like, oh, we got drunk again or whatever. And so when I was thinking about being a Baha'i, I was like, I can't stop drinking alcohol. Like, it's like I've been drinking alcohol since I was a baby. So it's like, like sips or whatever. But like, that concept was really hard for me. But then the more and more I started reading the writings about and then learning about science in general and how alcohol, what it plays and what its role is on your brain and how it can affect you and cause holes and all that stuff like that. The more and more I started thinking about it, and the more I started understanding Baha'u'llah's writings and just taking leaps of faith, I started realizing more and more that it doesn't, whether or not I had alcohol in my life, it does not make me that person. Like, what if I just separated myself from it and see what happens? And so, like, I was uncomfortable, to your point, and the more and more I just took those changes or those leaps, then I noticed, and confirmation came that, like, there's no need for it. Like, you can live without alcohol. You can be in a social environment with friends and family and not be an outcast or still be considered part of it, And there was a lot of discrimination, which is really interesting. A lot of people stopped inviting me to parties, or they thought that I wouldn't be cool or fun to hang out with because I wasn't willing to drink. Or my cousin's joke was that my cousins didn't get that I wasn't drinking alcohol because of religious purposes. They thought it was because of gluten. So my cousins bought me gluten-free vodka. And I was like, no, you're not getting it.
There's no such thing.
There is. It says gluten-free on the vodka.
It didn't to begin with. It's hard for marketing.
But, like, it was becoming to the point where it just didn't bother me anymore. And for me, that was being obedient, not understanding why Baha'u'llah was asking us to really doing it. I mean, he gave his concepts. It's not good for you, it doesn't benefit you in any way, yada, yada. But I still had to change my perspective and what I was used to doing, what was very common for me. And that was a very hard decision for me. And it wouldn't be a hard decision to other people, but alcohol is a part of, like, my family dynamics. Or my friendship dynamics, and it felt like I was being somebody different and being obedient to something I didn't understand why I had to be obedient to it. Mm-hmm. And so I think, when we're reading all these things, I constantly have this contradiction in my head with, like, you must be obedient, and at the same time, I'm also supposed to be unique and genuine and, question, because I questioned a lot in my religious beliefs. And it's gotten me to this point now in life. But at that time, it was really bad for me to go to a church, evangelical church with my uncle, and then go back to Catholicism class. It was very, very bad. So, all I did was learn about Moses that day. So it was like, It's just this constant contradiction of the things that you're supposed to do and the things you're not allowed to do and then the things that you should do. And I don't know. I'm very conflicted by a lot of these quotes.
Yeah.
Actually, that inspired me of connecting. So if these are contentment, refers to contentment, is going back to how do we attach this to, connect it to independent investigation of truth. So again, goes back to if we expect an outcome, it's already programmed. And in independent investigation of truth, we are supposed to unprogram. So it's matching, right? If it's content, if these four phrases are referring to contentment, it's matching, because it's all about, again, undoing.
Yeah.
Makes sense?
Yeah.
No, but I don't expect it to.
Because of the
It
veg.
makes sense. It makes sense. It makes
You
beautiful
sounded
sense.
like
you're
sound of
content.
God from
This is your Lord speaking.
Blasphemy.
Oh, I knew
Blasphemy.
God would sound like that.
No, that makes beautiful sense.
But you know, the other thing that just comes to mind as we sort of dig deeper into this is like when Barbara's talking about Jesus and the two great commandments, and I remember when I learned that Baha'u'llah had his own articulation of that, it seemed to me that, you know, where Jesus says there are two commandments. This is the first one is God, and the second one is your neighbor as yourself. And there's kind of a conflation of the two by Baha'u'llah. It's like, by loving God, you can't help but love your neighbor. But it's still the first commandment because it's for God, that you realize the depth of your nature, your neighbor, the deservingness, as it were, of you opening your heart in a loving way to make that person have a richer life, which is what acting in love would be in the world. So it's like underneath this process and the independent search for truth, you can't just automatically know what your neighbor needs. So the search for truth is, who is this person? I'm not going to just love somebody like a Baptist minister in Africa, like in Poisonwood Bible or something. It says, I know what you need. You need Jesus in your life, and this is what it looks like. And I'll give my whole life to doing that, and it's well-intentioned. But ultimately, it's a tremendous challenge to figure out what is it that a person that I encounter in my life really needs that's going to break apart that pre-programming of what I think that person needs. I have to keep searching for the truth of encountering this person right now with the qualities that I have, the needs that this person has, respect for that person so I'm not foisting something on them because they don't even want it. That's a really deep, rich, challenging task. But it seems like that's what we're called to do. And that is the law of love. And I think there's authority in seeing the beauty in God telling us, look to what this person, where they are in their life, you know, and how can you be a medium for God, the physician, helping to build up their life.
I have a question for you, Gary. So, you have a duty to love another. Do you have a duty for them to receive your love? Because that's what you're sort of saying. And I'm not so sure that you have a duty that they should receive your love.
I guess what I would say to that is they are free to take or leave whatever I offer them. My challenge,
Yeah, we know that part.
yes, but my challenge is to try in humility and attentiveness and intellectual, emotional search, if that person wants to receive me, to figure out what it is that I can give that isn't just me, you know, grandstanding about my goodness. What is it that that person seems to need? And maybe that's where consultation comes in. Maybe I need to talk to him. Who'd have thought?
This is touching on something I've been working hard on these last few years, and that is, I really want to help. I really want to contribute. I really want to support you to the point that it's an act of ego. Watch how well I can be helpful, right? And so in the last year or two, I've really tried to become more responsive to those opportunities where I am invited into someone's life. Could you help me with this? Yes. Rather than, I see you're missing that, and I have a good idea about how that need could be met.
That's your point.
That's my point.
And I think the difference is a big one, because I'm sorry, I've forgotten your first name. David. When you were saying something about you feel good when you are acting in that way, and I feel, just personally, I feel good when someone has asked me for assistance or help or a ride or whatever, and I do it, and when I end up acting on my personal impulse, which usually is going to come out of some kind of ego or need or fear or something, and I do something that might be a really big deal, I don't particularly feel good. And I certainly have learned in a number of relationships that what flowers out of that is resentment towards me for pushing my nose into somebody else's life without being invited. Anyway, that's kind of off the track,
But we can all relate to that in some way or form. For sure. Like, it's just, like, in my family dynamic, it's really easy for anybody in my family to be like, oh, I need something, and to immediately just jump in and throw myself into the mix and be like, I'll fix it, I'll do it. And my family's gotten so used to it. And so, like, my therapist recently told me that my new thing is to not throw myself in and to ask. And so, like, that's been really difficult for me. So, like, just asking. So, like, my mother is going through breast cancer right now. And so my immediate gut reaction was I'm going there, I'm going to take care of you, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. And my brain just went there, and my therapist was like, you gave yourself breast cancer. I was like, I did? She's like, you basically did by, like, saying you're going to do all these things, and you never asked your mom what she wanted. And so I asked her, do you want me to be there? That conversation. And she said no. And so, okay. And then I think my obedience in that regard is to think differently, to be there where she wants me to be there, and not intrude on what she's going through. And that's, and also the whole concept of, thinking differently and respecting other people's boundaries.
Another thing about my will versus God's will, I love the imagery about merging. I don't know where that was. Perpetual union with God is meant that men should merge their will wholly in the will of God. And the other thought that crossed my mind is, if I'm trying to do something and it's my idea, it's a good idea, it's my idea. Right? And when I pause and just check it out with my husband, check it out with my girlfriend, tapping into the experience of consultation is revealing to me of God's will and helps me distinguish from my own ambition or desires.
So I had a question then on God.
Let's hear it.
So, when I was younger, I went to a good Baptist church, and God, to me in those days, God was like a white-haired old gentleman up there in the sky somewhere with a orchestra little thing here, and he was running the show. and causing things to happen. Lightning and thunder, and he was judging people right and left and based on what they were doing. And by God, if you didn't do the right thing,
You would know.
fire and brimstone was going to happen. And it was. I used to joke now. In those days, they were trying to get me to heaven by scaring the hell out of me. That was when I was younger, and that was my concept of God. And with that type of a concept, and you read about God's will, and you think of this orchestra guy up here telling you what to do and how to do, you're going to have a whole different concept versus when you go to the other end, which is more like the Gaia concept. God is Gaia. All of the world, the earth, the skies, everything that exists is all God. It's all part of God. God is, from a Baha'i point of view, God is unknowable. So to begin with, I'd be more like the Jewish, I think, view that God is unknowable. Therefore, you even say the word has already restricted your concept. You just say the word itself, it means that you've already got it wrong. Your thought about what God is, then you automatically got it wrong. So, that's a whole different concept of God, right? Yeah. And there's a lot of gods in between.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And as we grow and mature spiritually, I think we go from this childlike concept of God to something where you give up on the concept of God. You give up, okay? And you do the best you can with what that's my view, but I don't know where everybody else comes from, because when you keep hearing all this stuff about God, if you have this concept of God, this is going to have a very different meaning to you than if you have the Gaia concept of God. Then this whole thing has a completely different meaning. It means everything completely different from, the two different, like your two different texts here. Am I wrong about this?
I think there's evolution within the individual. There's evolution in society. The Baha'i image is often given to that, is that of we're progressing from childhood through adolescence into maturity. And we see in a child how their ego starts developing, and that's a good thing. If you're 2 or 3, it's a natural part of the development cycle to develop a strong sense of self. You're going to navigate the world with that self. If you didn't have a strong sense of self, and if it wasn't properly formed when you're 2 or 3 or whatever, you would have developmental issues. Likewise, humanity is developing, and during its childhood, we had a certain relationship, say, to power and authority, which was, there's this absolute divine right of kings. There's absolute authority of scripture and of whatever the clergy or whatever religious leadership, and that was like maybe appropriate to that early childhood stage of humanity. Maybe appropriate to think of God as throwing the thunderbolts, because it tended to align human behavior in pro-social ways, which is in the end aligned towards ultimate reality. Because if reality is in the direction of a world civilization, then it's in the direction of pro-social behavior. But then something happened a few hundred years ago, and it broke that mold, that way of relating to authority and power and God and submission, all of that. Suddenly, with the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, it's like the dawning adolescence of the human race. Suddenly, it's not be obedient to the religious authorities. Now it's dare to know. That was Immanuel Kant's summation of the spirit of the Enlightenment. Dare to know. And disobedience was then the rule. And not disobedience for the sake of it, but because all of those power structures that demanded your obedience were not aligned with reality. And by throwing those off, you came to a much closer relationship to reality. We understood how the world works only after throwing off the shackles of how people read the Bible, in a literalistic way, just for example. And part of what the tension that I have when I read these passages is I can't get entirely out of the mindset that it's a really good thing to be in this position of fundamental doubt and suspicion towards authority. Because I see the incredible advance it's unlocked for humanity to throw off those chains and to recognize no intrinsic authorities beyond the authority of reason and experimentation and figuring things out, trial on it, the way you do scientifically, and not by accepting as given that there's some absolute authority that you must follow. And it's been so successful, not just in the Department of Science, but then as it applies to politics and so forth. We have the rebirth of democracy in the modern time, which we'll see where that experiment goes. But it's hard for me to sort of get past that sort of an admiration of that the spirit of non-obedience as actually representing in some way a spiritual leap forward from the childhood stage in which we saw the gods as these absolute power brokers throwing the thunderbolts. But if I'm to press the analogy further, well, if that enlightenment is the adolescent stage, well, after adolescence comes maturity. And what happens when adults become mature? Well, they stop just breaking all the rules just for the sake of breaking the rules, which you do as an adolescent because you're testing the boundaries. You're learning by trial and error. You do this thing happens. And you reach a point where you realize there's wisdom to following the laws. There's wisdom to paying your taxes. There's wisdom to brushing your teeth at night, and doing all the things that formally constrain your action in certain ways. But you understand as an adult that those constraints are good.
Before that.
Because you've tested all the boundaries and broke the rules and suffered and all of that. And I think maybe humanity is going through that. It's going to go through that process as well. Which, but I don't know what to conclude from all this, except that maybe in the end, wisdom leads us to understand that certain constraints have a purpose, but that also fighting against those constraints also has a purpose in its own context, in its own place and time.
To me, that's, when I watch my kids and watch them go through their mistakes as I see them, it took me a while to accept that their behavior's not going along with what I expected of them. It took me a long time to get to a point where I not only accepted it, but realized it was so important and necessary for them and every single individual to follow whatever path, because all of those things, mistakes and everything, are for their edification. And why am I getting in the way of that? Who am I? Now, as their when they're children, if I had that forethought, I would have raised them a bit differently. I should say my behavior would have been much better in the way that I...
See, now you've learned that.
Exactly. Much to their...
Are you ready for grandparents?
Yeah. Unfortunately, they had to put up with it, but even that is really fascinating because they've really seen the change in me from being a very strict parent to just being so accepting of whatever they're doing. But the thing that you mentioned, though, is you are what was the word you used about how you really are fond of this idea of disobedience?
Yeah.
But you used a certain word I can't remember, but obedience to what, though? What we all have in society have been obedient to is not necessarily God's will. It's somebody's expression of what God's will is, somebody's interpretation, and those are all the things that we are. And I think it's that questions are what's probably the healthiest way to look at it, as opposed to maybe that's the more mature way of looking at it. And the one thing that scientific enlightenment did for us was help us dissolve all of these preconceived ideas of what God is. And because, atheism, I used to really have a problem with that. And then I started to go, oh my gosh, these folks actually have a much closer idea of what God is or isn't than I do. I'm stuck in these concepts.
Yeah.
So all of this is awesome, I think. I mean, and it's all part of the society's progress, and individual humans is going through and making all these mistakes, and all of this questioning and all of this angst and all this stuff that happens to us is all there for a really good reason. And and that's, to me, when you can accept that, you can submit yourself to God's will. This is the way it's going. And then you can go, oh, okay, things aren't so bad. I don't have to be all freaked out by everything.
But it's like indoctrination, growing up and learning something for such a long period of time and believing that is a core belief, and then learning in life that that doesn't exist, or that doesn't matter, or it's not that big of a deal. I think when I became Baha'i, that happened a lot where I felt like my brain was breaking because there's these things that I grew up with that I didn't know were a big deal to me, and that I held pillars of truth around, and I was like, no, that existed and that happened, right? Maybe it did and maybe it didn't. Whether it did or didn't doesn't it, for instance, an example. I'm not gonna say examples, but what I will say is if Christ did do something, whether he did or he didn't, it doesn't change who he was and what his mission was. And so my immediate reaction to some things that I read were no, that happened literally. And then I remember later on thinking no, it's okay if it didn't happen literally. I was taught one way to believe something, and then there's a freedom the minute you let go, and you're that's not that big a deal. Whether it happened or not, it's not that big a deal.
Because what's the point of that message? It's to learn something
to
spiritual.
Learn something from it,
to make a spiritual change.
And a lot of those literal metaphors, or we think are literal, but they're metaphors, were to tell a story, to explain something, for us to have a concrete understanding of something. Whether it was real or not is not the point. And that took unraveling a lot of things that I just thought were core beliefs. I didn't even know were core beliefs until someone said something, and I was like, absolutely not. I was like, that's not true. And then reading into Baha's writings and being okay, maybe it may not be true.
And maybe I don't know.
And it doesn't matter whether
that not knowing.
But there's a freedom in that, of losing that. And I think, that kind of reminds me of this last quote, which is, he doeth as he doeth. What recourse have we? If we carrieth out his will, he ordaineth what he pleaseth. And then better for thee to bow down thy head in submission and put thy trust in the all-merciful Lord.
Maybe that's a good point to.
The other observation is this.
Yeah.
Baha'u'llah says, I took all the writings of the past and summarized them into hidden words, right?
Yeah.
So it doesn't mean that's applicable. Some of these hidden words could not be applicable at this point because it's taken from the past.
Our generation.
Do you think that's the case? Do you think he's just summarizing it just as an exercise of summation, and they're no longer in force?
I don't know. I mean, is that a possibility? What I said could there be any truth in what I said?
Yeah.
If there is, then we have to question. Are these all hidden words applicable in this time?
That's a good point.
Well, he said it's the inner essence that's been clothed in the garment of brevity, and if anything is not going to change over time, it would be the inner essence of the thing. The outer garment changes, but the inner essence is supposed to. Of course, Baha'u'llah does say the only thing that's actually unchanging is the law of love. But these are arguably all expressions of the law of love, all these different themes that we're exploring.
And then there's the process of me reading that and making meaning of it, which is an individual process for each one of us. So it's not snare means whatever, that we, part of our individual search for reality and truth is part of the mix there.
So those things change when we observe them, just like in quantum physics, right? As soon as we observe them.
They've always existed. Like, when you look into the microscope, and microbes and cells always existed. We just didn't know it did. That kind of concept. It's like,
Well, that's like men and women have always been equal, right? We just didn't know it. We still don't know it.
We still don't know.
Still don't know it.
We'll get there.
It's always been true.
I'm not feeling like
It's always been true.
All right, enough for one night?
Yeah, thank you.